Good morning, everyone. It is a Tuesday here, and it is April 14th. This is going to be our guided mini lesson for our assignment that's due tomorrow on Wednesday, April 15th. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be reading chapters 4, 5, and 6 of Frindle. Frindle has been an interesting book so far. We're learning about our characters. I hope you're enjoying hearing the read aloud here. What we're going to do is we're going to read these chapters, and then on Monday we are going to have a guest reader that is going to be coming in and reading and posting a video very similar to this. So our assignments for Thursday, it's going to be due at 11:59, are going to be to watch this video in its entirety, or you can read the PDF version on your own, and then you are going to be answering some comprehension questions, some inference questions, and doing some character studies within Google Classroom. For our first mini lesson, everything that's been turned in has looked fantastic. So without further ado, let's get started here. Chapter 4, Word Detective. It was a beautiful September afternoon. Bright sun, cool breeze, blue sky, but not for Nick. Nick had to do a little report for the next day, plus copy out all the definitions for 35 words. Mrs. Granger. This was not the way school was supposed to work, not for Nick. There was a rule at Nick's house, homework first, and that meant right after school. Nick had heard his older brother James groan and grumble about this rule for years, right up until he graduated from high school 2 years ago. And then James wrote home from college after his first semester and said, "My grades are looking great because when I came here, I already knew how to put first things first." That letter was proof. It was proof Nick's mom and dad had been looking for. Homework first was the law from September to June. This had never bothered Nick before because he hardly ever had any homework. Oh, sure, he looked over his spelling words on Thursday nights, and there had been a few short book reports in 4th grade. But other than that, nothing. Up to now, schoolwork never spilled over into his free time. Thanks to Mrs. Granger, those days were gone. First, he looked up the definitions in his brand new red dictionary that his mom had bought, just because Mrs. Granger told her to. It took almost an hour. He could hear a baseball game in John's yard down the street, yelling and shouting. Every few minutes, the sharp crack of the bat connecting with a pitch. But he had a report to do for Mrs. Granger. Nick looked at the very front of the dictionary. There was an introduction to the book called Words and Their Origins. Perfect, Nick thought. It was just what he needed to do his report. It would all be over in a few minutes. Nick could already feel the sun and the breeze on his face as he ran outside to play, homework all done. Then he read the first sentence from the introduction. Without question, this modern American dictionary is one of the most surprisingly complex and profound documents ever to be created, for it embodies unparalleled etymological detail, reflecting not only superb lexicographic scholarship, but also the dreams and speech and imaginative talents of millions of people over thousands of years. For every person who has ever spoken or written in English has had a hand in its making. What? Nick scratched his head and read it again. Then again, not much better. It was sort of like trying to read the ingredients on a shampoo bottle. He slammed the dictionary shut and walked downstairs. Nick's family did a lot of reading, so bookshelves covered 3 of the 4 walls in the family room. There were 2 sets of encyclopedias, the black set for grown-ups and the red set for kids. Nick pulled out the D volume from the red set and looked up dictionary. There were 3 full pages with headings like early dictionaries, word detectives, and dictionaries today. Not very exciting. But he had to do it, so Nick just plopped down on the couch and read all of it. And when he was finished with the kids' book, he opened up the black encyclopedia and read most of what it said about dictionaries too. He understood only about half of what he was reading. He leaned back on the couch and covered his eyes with his arm, trying to imagine himself giving a report on all this boring stuff. He'd be lucky to have 3 minutes worth. But because Nick was Nick, he suddenly had an idea, and it brought a grin to his face. Nick decided that giving this report could actually be fun. He could make it something special. After all, Mrs. Granger had asked for it. All right, so as we go into chapter 5 here, I want us to think about what we know about Nick already. There are a lot of really, really interesting things about Nick that, have come up so far. So we know that he's mischievous. We know that he's smart, but he's a little bit of a troublemaker. He gets himself into a little bit of trouble. So as we go through here, what we are going to do is, here are our assignments. So for chapter 5, I want us to think about this. And this is going to be in Google Classroom. And sorry it's a little bit blurry, but I will repost this into your assignment. But do you think Mrs. Granger is a good teacher? We're going to use this as a writing and journaling exercise, but just think to yourself, what makes a good teacher? Why is Mrs. Granger a good teacher? Why is she not a good teacher? Would you want a teacher like Mrs. Granger? This should be a paragraph response, kind of similar to a center's journal, right? And I'll explain this in Google Classroom, but this is going to be one of your assignments. All right. Chapter 5. The report. By lunchtime the next day, Nick had a bad feeling in the pit of his stomach. 7th period was coming. He was going to have to stand up in front of Mrs. Granger's class. The eyes of everyone in the class would be glued to his face, and Mrs. Granger's eyes would be cranked up to their maximum punch power. He looked over his notes again and again. The first English dictionary, the growth of the English language, William Shakespeare. We know about William Shakespeare. Words from French and German, new words, old words, new inventions, Anglo-Saxon words, Latin and Greek roots, American English. It all just became a big jumble in his mind. In his grand plan from the night before, in the harsh fluorescent light of the school day, it seemed impossible. What is it with clocks in a school? When you're planning to go to the carnival after school, the clock ticks in every class practically run backwards, and the school day lasts for about 3 whole weeks. But if you have to go to the barber shop or go shopping for clothes after school, zip, the whole day is over before you can blink. But today, after lunch, periods 5 and 6 went by in 2 ticks. As the 7th period bell rang, Mrs. Granger walked into the classroom, took 4 steps to her desk at the big side of the room, flipped open her attendance book, glanced out at the class, and made 2 little check marks. Then, looking up at Nick, she said, "I think we have a little report to begin our class today. Nicholas?" 15 seconds into 7th period, and Nick was already on stage. This lady plays for keeps, thought Nick. He gulped, grabbed his crumpled note card and his book bag, and walked to the front of the room. He stood next to the giant dictionary on its little table, and Mrs. Granger walked to the back of the classroom and sat primly at the tall stool next to the bookcases. She was wearing her blue uniform. Taking a deep breath, Nick began. "Well, the first thing I learned is that the first English dictionary," Mrs. Granger interrupted. "Excuse me, Nicholas, but does your report have a title?" Nick looked blankly. "A title? No, I didn't make a title." "Class, please remember to include a title whenever you prepare an oral or written report. Now please go on, Nicholas." She smiled and nodded at him. Nick began again. Looking right at Mrs. Granger, he said, "The dictionary," a couple kids thought it was funny, but Nick played it straight and just kept talking. "A lot of people think the first English dictionary was put together in the 1700s by a man named Samuel Jackson. He lived in London, England. He was real smart. He wrote a lot of books, and he wanted all the other smart people to have a good dictionary to use, so he made one. But there were other dictionaries before his. The thing that was different about Johnson's dictionary was its size, first of all. He had over 43,000 words in it. The class made a bunch of noises at this big number, like, ooh, and wow, and stuff like that. Nick lost his concentration. He glanced up at Mrs. Granger, expecting to see those eyes drilling a hole in him. But they weren't. They were almost friendly, in a teachery kind of way. She shushed the class and said, "Go on, Nicholas. That's a fine beginning." Nick almost smiled, but he saw all the kids staring at him, so he gripped his note card even tighter and jumped back in. The other thing that Samuel Johnson did was to choose the words he thought were most important and then give lots of examples showing how the words got used by people. For example, he showed how the word take could be used 113 different ways. Nick's report went on smoothly for 12 minutes. Nick was surprised at how easy it was to stand there and talk about this stuff. At the end of the first 5 minutes, Mrs. Granger had to stop Nick again to say, "Class, it is not good manners to yawn out loud or put your heads down on your desks when someone is giving an oral report." No one in the class cared even a little bit about this report, except Mrs. Granger. Every time Nick glanced up, she was smiling. And her eyes were not the least bit icy or sharp. She was eating this stuff up, listening and nodding, and every once in a while she would say, "Very good point," or "Yes, that's exactly right." But the next time Nick looked up, it was Mrs. Granger sneaking a look at her watch. 18 minutes gone. Maybe his idea was gonna work after all. Time for phase 2. Reaching into his book bag, Nick pulled out the red dictionary he had brought from home, and the one that most kids had, the one Mrs. Granger said they should use. Nick said, "This is the dictionary that I use at home for my vocabulary work, and I opened it up last night to the very front, and right there I found out a lot about how the dictionary was made, right in this book. So I thought some of the ideas would be good as part of my report," it says here. "Nicholas," Nick looked up. Mrs. Granger got off her stool, and its wooden legs made a screech on the linoleum. Heads snapped to attention, and the class was on alert again. Mrs. Granger smiled, raised her eyebrows, and pointed at her watch. "Nicholas, I think the class should read that at home themselves." Now, John's hand went up in the air. And it was at Mrs. Granger's nod that he said, "But I don't have the dictionary at home, Mrs. Granger. I have the blue one." And several other kids immediately said, "Yeah, me too." Mrs. Granger tried not to show that she was annoyed. "Very well, Nick, but it shouldn't take too long. We have other things to do today." Nick kept his eyes open wide and nodded, adjusted his glasses on his nose, and began to read. Without question, this modern American dictionary is one of the most surprisingly complex and profound documents ever to be created, for it embodies unparalleled etymological, it's a tough word, detail, reflecting not only superb lexicographic scholarship, but also the dreams and speech and imaginative talents of millions of people over thousands of years. For every person who has ever spoken or written in English has had a hand in making. It was a long article and the kids were bored to death, but no one looked bored at all. Every kid in the room knew now that the period was more than half over. And Nick's report wasn't just a report. It was one of the greatest time wasters he had ever invented. Mrs. Granger knew it too. She had edged around from the back of the room to the side near the windows. Nick glanced up at her now, and then as he read each time, Mrs. Granger's eyes clicked up to a new proper level. After 8 minutes of Nick's nonstop reading, her eyes were practically burning holes in the chalkboard behind him. There were only 10 minutes left in 7th period. When he took a breath to start a new paragraph, Mrs. Granger cut him off. "That's a fine place to stop, Nicholas. Class, let's all give him a round of applause for his report." The applause didn't last long. As Nick took his book bag and notes and sat down, Mrs. Granger's eyes went back to almost normal. And she actually smiled at him. "Although your report was quite long," she paused to let that sink in. "It was quite a good one. And isn't it fascinating that English has more different words than any other language used anywhere in the world?" She pointed at her large dictionary. "That one book contains the definitions of more than 450,000 words. Now, wasn't I right, Nicholas? All this will mean so much more since you learned it on your own." Mrs. Granger was beaming at him. Nick sank lower in his chair. This was worse than writing the report, worse than standing up to give it. He was being treated like the teacher's pet. And he had the feeling she was doing it on purpose. His reputation was in great danger. So he launched another question. He raised his hand and didn't even wait for Mrs. Granger to call on him. Yeah, but I still don't really get the idea of why words all mean different things. Like, who says that D-O-G means the thing that goes woof and wags its tail? Who says so? And Mrs. Granger took the bait. Who says dog means dog? You do, Nicholas. You and me and everyone in this class, in the school, in the town, in the state, in the country. We all agree. If we live in France, we would all agree that the right word for a hairy four-legged creature was a different word, chien. It sounds like sheen. But it means dog. It means what dog means. Notice the different languages showing what a dog is. Perro, canis, chien, dog. You and me, and in Germany they say Hund, and so on all around the globe. But if all of us in this room decided to call that creature something else, and if everyone else did too, then that's what it would be called. And one day it would be written in the dictionary. That way, we decide what goes in the book. And she pointed at the giant dictionary. And then she looked right at Nick and smiled again. Then Mrs. Granger went on. But of course that dictionary was worked on by hundreds of very smart people for many years. So, as far as we're concerned, that dictionary is the law. Laws can change, of course, but only if they need to. There may be new words that need to be made, but the only ones in the book that have the ones in that book have been put in there for a good reason. Mrs. Granger took a look at the clock. 8 minutes left. Now then, for today, you are to have done the exercises beginning on page 12 of your Words Alive book. Please get out your papers. Sarah, will you read the first sentence, identify the mistake, and then tell us how it can be corrected? Mrs. Granger jammed the whole day's work into the last 8 minutes. A blur of verbs, nouns, and prepositions. And yes, there was another homework assignment. And Nick didn't try to sidetrack Mrs. G again. He had slowed her down a little bit, but had he stopped her? No way. She was unstoppable, at least for today. All right, chapter 6. So, one really interesting thing here that we're noticing is Mrs. Granger goes to this idea that words are in the dictionary because we all agree that they mean the same thing. So, Nick in chapter 6 is going to get a big idea. I want you to think to yourself, what prediction can you make here? If words are in the dictionary because we all agree that they mean something, and Nick's kind of a troublemaker, what do we think Nick's going to do? So that's what we're going to be paying attention to in chapter 6. This is going to be our last chapter here for the sake of this mini lesson. But also remember, we have this chapter 5 question right here. Do you think Miss Granger's a good teacher? Why or why not? There's some things in chapter 5 that maybe show us she's a really good teacher. But there's also some things that show us maybe she's maybe a little too strict or maybe a little too hard on her students. So I don't know. Let's think about that. All right, let's read chapter 6, and then I'll go through the remainder of our questions here in our assignments. Chapter 6, the big idea. 3 things happened later that same afternoon. Nick and Janet Fisk had missed the bus because of a school newspaper meeting, so they walked home together. They were seeing who could walk along the curb without falling. It took a lot of concentration, and when Janet stepped off into the street, Nick said, "That's 3 points for me." But Janet said, "I didn't fall. I saw something. Look." She bent down and picked up a gold ballpoint pen, the fancy kind. That was the first thing, Janet finding the pen. They got back on the curb, and Nick followed Janet, putting one foot carefully in front of the other, walking on the narrow concrete curb. And while he stepped along, he thought back over the school day, especially about his report, and what Mrs. Granger had said about words at the end of the period finally sank in. That was the second thing, understanding what Mrs. Granger had said. She had said, "Who says dog means dog? You do, Nicholas." "You do, Nicholas," he repeated to himself. "I do?" Nick thought, still putting one foot in front of the other, following Janet. "What does that mean?" And then Nick remembered something. When he was about 2 years old, his mom had bought him one of those unbreakable cassette players and a bunch of sing-along tapes. He had loved them, and he played them over and over and over and over. And he would carry the tape And he would carry the tape and the player to his mother and big brother and father and bang them together and say, "Guagagala, guagagala, guagagala," until someone put the cassette in the machine and turned it on. And for 3 years, whenever he said guagagala, his family knew that he wanted to hear those pretty sounds made with voices and instruments. Then, when Nick went to preschool, he learned that if he wanted his teacher and the other kids to understand him, he had to use the word music. But guagagala meant that nice sound to Nick, because Nick said so. Who says guagagala means music? You do, Nicholas. "No fair," yelled Janet. They were at the corner of the street, and Nick had bumped into her, completely absorbed in his thoughts. Janet stumbled off the curb, and the gold pen in her hand clattered onto the street. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to, honest," said Nick. "I just wasn't watching. Here." Nick stooped over and picked up the pen and held it out. "Here's your..." And then, this is when the third thing happened. Nick didn't say pen. Instead, he said, "Here's your Frindle." "Frindle?" Janet took her pen and looked at him like he was nuts. She wrinkled her nose and said, "What's a Frindle?" Nick grinned, and he said, "You'll find out. See you later." It was there, at the corner of Spring Street and South Grand Avenue, 1 block from home on a September afternoon. That's when Nick got the big idea. I loved the illustrations in this book. This gives us an idea of what Nick and then Janet look like. I love when we read chapter books like this because we can paint our own picture of what these characters look like, but Andrew Clements does a great job of including some really cool images. There is the Frindle. And by the time he had run down the street and up the steps and through the door and upstairs to his room, it wasn't just a big idea. It was a plan. A whole plan, just begging for Nick to put it into action. And action was Nick's middle name. The next day after school, the plan began. Nick walked into the penny pantry store and asked the lady behind the counter for a Frindle. She squinted at him. "A what?" "A Frindle." "A Frindle, please, a black one," said Nick. Nick smiled at her. She leaned over closer and aimed one ear at him. "You want a what?" "A Frindle." And this time Nick pointed at the ballpoint pens behind her on the shelf. "A black one, please." So the lady handed Nick the pen. He handed her 49 cents and said, "Thank you," and left the store. 6 days later, Janet stood at the counter of the penny pantry. The same store, same lady. John had come in the day before, and Pete the day before that, and Chris the day before that, and Dave the day before that. Janet was the 5th kid that Nick had sent there to ask the woman for a Frindle. And when she asked, the lady reached for the pens and said, "Blue or black?" Nick was standing 1 aisle away at the candy racks and was grinning. Frindle was a real word. It meant pen. Who says Frindle means pen? You do, Nicholas. Half an hour later, a group of serious fifth graders had a meeting in Nick's playroom. It was John, Pete, Dave, Chris, and Janet. Add Nick, that's 6 kids. 6 secret agents. They held up their right hands and read the oath that Nick had written out. From this day on and forever, I will never use the word pen again. Instead, I will use the word Frindle, and I will do everything possible so others will too. And all 6 of them signed the oath with Nick's Frindle. The plan would work. Thanks, Mrs. Granger. All right, so we're going to stop here. We're going to have a guest reader read Chapter 7, Word Wars, on Monday, but I hope you're all kind of starting to get into this a little. We see what Nick's master plan is here. He is inventing a word. Mrs. Granger had told him that words are words because we agree that they're words. He came up with the word gagawala, or gwala gaga, for a music player when he was younger. And then when he went to preschool, he stopped using that word. But now he's thinking, okay, if I change the name of a pen to a Frindle and everyone else starts using it, maybe everyone else will call a pen a Frindle. So we can see that something's happening here, and this is really going to paint a picture for the rest of the plot. thinking to yourself here where we're at on a plot diagram, I would not really think that we're at the climax yet. And if we're not at the climax, where are we on the plot diagram? Or are we at the climax? Something you need to think about. All right, so our assignments. We're going to be inferencing here. So, topic 2, a living language has 2 words added to it all the time. Some are made up just for fun. In the story, Nick invents the word Frindle and begins a word war. Write a paragraph describing how the word Frindle comes into existence. You're going to have to do this in Google Classroom, answering these questions. What are Nick and Janet going to do on the afternoon that Nick invents the word Frindle? Explain why they're together. Then Janet does something that becomes the first event in the creation of the word Frindle. What is the thing that Janet does? What is Nick thinking about just before he bumps into Janet? Think of what happens as Nick bumps into Janet. Describe the final third event of the invention. So, this is when they're walking on the curb. What's happening here? Answer these questions in paragraph form, 5 to 6 sentences. Next, you're going to do a character profile of Nick based on what you know about him. This should be pretty easy. I want you to include at least 2 examples in here for each. We know about his family. We know about his character traits. From the pictures, we kind of know what he looks like. What's he good at? What's he not so good at? What do other characters say about him? We know he has friends. What do they think about him? Then in chapters 5 and 6, Nick has 2 big ideas. Do you think he was right or wrong to use this plan, to start on this plan? I want you here to use your personal beliefs to help you make up your own judgment, meaning this is an opinion piece. Tell me his 2 big ideas. His 2 big ideas, I'll tell you the first big idea he has is to waste the time of Miss Granger. The second big idea is that he is going to do something with the word pen. Do you think that, using your own beliefs, do you think that he is right or wrong to do this and have these plans created? Then you're going to have some comprehension questions like this. They are multiple choice. This should take you some time. Please take some time on this. I want you to treat this like centers work. And with that being said, centers work, as we know, takes maybe hour and a half. One of these, we would have, each of these would be almost a center station, but they're all going to be in Google Classroom. So with that being said, good luck. I'll be available for office hours tomorrow and Thursday. This is going to be due Thursday night, so good luck. Looking forward to seeing your answers, and have a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful Wednesday.